Get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's event. This is a very special one. And before I even introduce the speaker, I just first of all wanted to say it's such an honor to be speaking with Justin here today. So 6 years ago, while I was interning at Microsoft, just like a quick story, Justin was my amazing supervisor who pretty much taught me a lot of things about what to do and what not to do about product management. So it's just really inspiring to be here and being able to like ask him amazing questions about his career. So thank you so much for joining us, Justin. Before I give you the chance to introduce yourself, I just quickly wanted to share some house rules with everyone here today. I'll just quickly introduce who we are and what we do. So my name is Shifumi Oshinake. For those who don't know me, I'm one of the co-founders of Collab. We do record our events, so by attending, you definitely grant consent. We also encourage you all to engage in the live chat. Feel free to also put in your questions. If you have any questions at any time during the talk, definitely put it into the chat, or we'll have a dedicated brief Q&A session at the end. Feel free to also share your takeaways and all the things that you gain from these events on social media. Feel free to tag us. There will also be a networking portion of these events, so feel free to stick around and meet other people and get to know them. A little bit about who we are and what we do. Like I mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of Collab. We're an online school essentially who helps career switchers to break into the tech industry for the very first time. And we do that by providing them with real world experience so that they can develop their skills through building projects and cross-functional teams. We've graduated over 500 students so far. 95% of those who tell us that they feel a lot more confident in their ability to work on a team and also ship products. And we have an amazing career advancement rate of 85% of folks landing jobs within 3 months. And we have alumni at top companies such as Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Apple, and much more. Maybe we'll get someone in GitHub very soon. So again, thank you so much for joining us. So I wanted to pass it over to you, Justin, to quickly introduce yourself to the audience before we get to the Q&A section of the event. Over to you, Justin.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. As I said, I'm Justin Hutchings, currently a director of product here at GitHub. I manage our supply chain security team, which is responsible for protecting all of your uses of open source. You know, everybody uses open source these days. And if you're not watching for vulnerabilities, chances are you're already shipping them. And so we make a bunch of products that help with that. Dependabot is maybe our most infamous product because it's out there helping everybody stay on top of vulnerable dependencies in their dependency trees. And I've been here for 4 years, and before that, I spent 11 at Microsoft, and did my undergrad at a very small place called Rose-Hulman before then. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that quick introduction. And again, I feel very inspired by being able to speak with you today. As I mentioned earlier, Justin was my supervisor while I was interning at Microsoft 6 years ago. So it's quite inspiring to be here and talking to you about your amazing career. So let's sort of start about your product management journey. How did you eventually land into product management, and why did you want to become a product manager?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I was in university and I took an internship, my sophomore year, working with a business development wing of our attached sort of innovation center, like our business accelerator. And it was a lot of fun working on what I would say are business problems, not just coding, not just technology, but always attached to technology. So I became really interested at that time in finding a way to go and do that sort of high impact work around making a technology organization more successful. And so I found, that next year I found an internship at Microsoft. I got an offer to be a program manager on the Windows team. I actually worked on Windows Vista at the time, which was an exciting project because it was so wildly overdue. And I worked on the Windows shell at the time, and it was incredible amounts of fun just trying to figure out all these details. I was working on wallpapers and personalization and screen resolutions, which I found was way more complicated than I thought. And, I ended up taking a job coming back, and I joined the print team, and, the rest is history from there.
Cool, awesome, remarkable. So could you even just quickly tell us about one of your favorite projects that you worked on at Microsoft in your 11 years that you spent at Microsoft? So if you to pick one, which one would it be?
It's hard to pick your favorites, but one of my first projects, I spent a while sort of listening to customers on their biggest pain points at Microsoft, specifically in this print space. And printer drivers were incredibly complicated for people to create. They took a tremendous amount of time. They were difficult to customize, difficult to build. When we did Windows 8, we were debuting an entirely new app model. And we had this point of friction where print drivers ran in process and they did a whole bunch of things they weren't supposed to. And so one of the projects I did at the time was figuring out how to rework the print driver model so that it could work well with the now defunct Windows 8 apps that were full screen and immersive. Because what we didn't want was to have this beautifully crafted full screen app that's great for a tablet and then have this battleship gray little dialogue pop up on top of it. We thought that would be A, really bad for touch, but B, just incredibly disruptive and confusing. And so we spent a ton of time building out a driver model that was going to work with that. And I point to that as one of my favorites of the things I did at Microsoft, because of we had basically a blank canvas to go and figure out the right way to do this that worked for developers on apps, worked for developers on drivers, and then was aligned with user expectations. And it was a lot of fun.
Cool, awesome. Thanks for sharing that with us. And we'll sort of like dive into maybe some of the Microsoft projects later on. But now you're at GitHub, you've been there for 4 years. So what is it like being a director of product management? What is your day-to-day like? What do you focus on as the director of product management at GitHub today?
Yeah, so at GitHub, a director role is a manager of other product managers. And so I'm blessed to be working with a team of product managers that work on all of these capabilities to help developers protect their usage of open source. And so day to day, my job switches from being in sort of meetings with my colleagues and direct reports to figure out what's going on, what are the things that are the most important to go after next, and helping them make tough trade-offs on, which thing do we prioritize, which thing do we not, because ultimately there's only so much, engineering talent to go around, and we have to be really deliberate about which things we decide to address first. So I spend a ton of time helping the team balance trade-offs and navigate that. But I'd say my favorite part of being a director is just, I spent a lot of time early on just seeking mentees and building new product management talent. Being a director, it's my job to help develop people and give them the expertise to be really good product managers. So I coach them through interpersonal problems or technical problems or just day-to-day challenges being a product manager to help them get better at the craft. And I love that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And I know we have like some aspiring product managers in the audience. So what are the kinds of things that you do or say to inspire the team of product managers that you lead at GitHub? Could you give us examples? I know something that you're passionate about. So if you could share a couple learnings for folks so they can add it into their toolkit, what would you recommend or what ways would you encourage them to start thinking about product management and their career and growth?
There's so many different things. It's very situational. One of the things that I look at is product managers should always have a really strong can-do attitude. Every once in a while, someone will pop a question into a doc and say, can we do this? And the answer to that is always, sure, anything's possible. But what can we not do if we choose to do that, right? Because we have a limited number of engineers and a limited amount of time before we want to get something done. And so oftentimes it's a matter of trade-offs and helping them understand and get better at telling stories about the trade-offs, right? Someone will ask us to do a thing because their customer really cares. Say, yeah, that's possible, but I think the trade-offs are too expensive. We would have to stop working on this other thing that the business really needs us to work on. Our customers are really demanding. And helping folks frame those trade-offs in a good way and say, look, I think this is the wrong time for that feature. So we're going to focus on this one to really make it complete and comprehensive before we, go broader, go wider, and get into more scenarios that are going to involve more users and more distractions and all that.
That's super helpful. And I'd like to even just like dive into that a little bit because there's this notion of product managers find it difficult to say no because you have so many asks from different people. Your teams are contributing ideas, your customers are contributing ideas. You also have ideas of your own. So, in what other ways, and I like the way you framed it, being able to talk about the trade-offs, what other ways would you recommend people being able to effectively communicate that? Because it's all about prioritization, like you said, solving the right problem at the right time. What other ways, or is there any other frameworks that you provide the people that you need to help them think about the way that they can communicate the trade-offs and the problems to other stakeholders?
I mean, I think it's important to recognize what kind of product you're building, right? If you're in a product area where you have to be date driven, maybe you just had a big acquisition that you completed and you've got to get something done by a conference to prove that you're doing this well and show your customers progress. When you're dealing with something date driven, be flexible on scope. Be willing to cut your way to shipping by that date. And on the other side of things, if you're dealing with something where you've got to be quality driven and the dates aren't especially important, be really clear on what your scope is, be really clear on what's your MVP and how will you iterate, and kind of have this idea of, hey, that first drop is not the last drop. It's not the ultimate state of that feature. And so what is the acceptable way to get it started, to get feedback, to learn from it, and figure out kind of which of those models you're in so that you can make the right trade-offs.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's super helpful. And I just wanted to even comment on that because I know there's some collab folks in the program and in the audience. And in our program, you only have 8 weeks to build a product from end to end. And one of the things we tell people all the time is reduce your scope, reduce your scope. And it's something that people find extremely difficult to do because they're always convinced that we just need to add these 3 features, that's what's going to make it work. So what advice would you give to students who are in that situation where they want to ship something exciting and but they only have like a limited time? Like you said, the date is not flexible. You have to present on demo day and you have to present something and you have to reduce the scope. What advice and what way would you tell that story so it's clear to them and they have the tools in their toolkit to be able to effectively scope down their projects?
I mean, the thing that I think is important to think about from like a business perspective, there's never a world where you go into a sales conversation or you meet with a customer, you say, this is what I have, and they don't ask for more. Never happens. So you might think like these 3 features are it. If I don't do those 3 features, it's worthless. That might be true, but just keep in mind, your customers will always want that next one. And so when you're doing that cut, just remember, you're always going to get pushed for more. And so your job is to really make sure you're focused on the most important ones that demonstrate the story you want to tell, that finish that use case and really solve that customer problem. And you can bolt on more and more over time, but you've got to be really focused on what is that minimum scenario that achieves the meaningful outcome that customers need. And just put out of your mind that you'll get them all done, because users always want more and it's impossible to get everything done, especially in a V1.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that. And so now let's move on to sort of like the topic of discussion. We're talking about technical products. And I even wanted to even just start by saying, there's a lot of chatter in the industry about, you don't necessarily have to be technical to be a PM. And there's a lot of non-technical PMs. And by non-technical, I define that as maybe not having a traditional computer science degree or not knowing how to code, which used to be the barrier of entry to become a product manager. What processes do you follow when building heavily technical products? So you're building products for developers and product managers. Some of them might not have been developers in the past. So what are the processes that you follow to make sure that the outcomes are very similar when you're solving, let's say like a regular consumer or customer facing problem?
I mean, I won't say that being a computer science graduate or a software engineer is a prerequisite for being a product manager, because I know a lot of tremendous product managers that did not study engineering, they did not study anything of that sort. I have a product manager on my team that is a GIS major, so they were dealing with geographic information systems and all that. And that is not a hamstring for those folks. However, having a computer science background can make it easier in certain conversations. And certainly the folks that I find that are most successful as non-technical product managers are folks that aren't afraid, A, to admit what they don't know, and B, to go and learn some of those skills. And so if your job requires you to deal with a database and that's your customer base, that's your market, don't just say, I never took a databases class back in college. I don't think I can do this. Go and play with it. Go and learn it. Go and get hands-on, and don't be afraid of the product. Because if you're afraid of the product and using it, you won't have the empathy that your customers need you to have to be effective. And so every product manager should be one of the best users of their product and should not be afraid to try and do the sorts of things that their customers will do with the product.
That's remarkable advice. So now, like that you're building like heavily technical products for developers, how do you put yourself in the developer's shoes? So could you just talk about that, or as part of like your product management process in general? How do you sort of like live that or enable the people that actually do the work, your reports, to actually live that and solve problems?
I think one of the big challenges at a company like GitHub, we obviously, it's a product that is built by engineers for engineers. One of the biggest challenges you get is sometimes, because you're the customer, you can get this sort of confirmation bias and you say, I know what I need. And you fail to consider that there are customers that work in different ways than you. One of the classic traps we run into at GitHub is like the way we do our branch merge strategy is different than the way some of our customers do. And it's like religious debate on what's correct, what's right, what's wrong. And so one of the best things that you can do, obviously, trust what you know, trust some of those skills and experiences that you and your team have had personally with the product, but also try and compartmentalize that and go talk to customers. Go have interviews, go read the forums and the feedback, read the support tickets, go talk to enterprises that are deploying and using your product, and get different points of view, because you have to recognize that your customers are not a monolith. They're all slightly different. They have different needs, different approaches, and the way they do things has a big effect on how your product works for them. And as long as you can do that and sort of develop this sort of multidimensional picture of what a typical customer is and the sorts of things they optimize for, you can deal with those trade-offs more effectively.
Cool. Nothing beats great old customer conversations. And then, is there any approach that you recommend or you recommend to your team to reaching out to customers or speaking to customers, or is there any standard practice that you use? Because a lot of folks, there's also another camp of people who say, don't talk to customers, just look at the data, just look at the usage data. So how do you balance some of those, and how do you continue to enforce the importance of still talking to customers as part of the product management practice?
It's interesting, the qualitative sort of customer informed conversations are super valuable. In security, though, we get weird behaviors where people will, when you talk to them about things, they'll virtue signal. If we sent you an alert like this, would you fix it? Would you click the green button? So absolutely, I would, without hesitation. Then you look at the data and you say, oh, it looks like not many people from your organization have done that. Why is that? Oh, well, that's because they have other priorities. And, if you don't have that balanced approach, you can end up with this idealized picture of what developers or customers are supposed to do versus the reality of what they're actually doing. Because oftentimes people aren't proud, or they're very optimistic about what they do. And so they'll tell you what they think you want to hear. And so there are some strategies you can use to change how you frame questions. So instead of asking, would you deal with this security alert? You ask the question, when is the last time you dealt with a security alert like this? Because when you ask them something that is a reflective question instead of a values-based question, they're much more likely to give you an honest recollection of, actually, I don't remember the last time I did that. that's a good point. And you can have more conversations about like, oh, did you see this? And, what did you do as a result? I think those are really important things to keep in mind, because you'll get different answers depending on whether you're looking only at the qualitative versus the quantitative. And I think of the PM as, the person that's responsible for bringing all that together into a coherent, if not comprehensive, strategy around what to do about, the reality across the customer base.
Awesome. That's super helpful. And to your point, I love the way you framed it, like asked reflective questions. And there's a resource that I always recommend to folks. So if you're curious about user research, there's a book called The Mom Test, I think by Scott Fitzgerald. It talks about how you can ask questions and design questions that will give you the right answers that you're looking for. And it touches on some of those things that you sort of mentioned. And you also talked about being comprehensive when it comes to bringing all of that information together. What would you recommend, or what are your strategies for communicating that and driving that clarity to your team and letting them know that, okay, you've gotten this user research, you've looked at the usage data, how do you then present that? And what best ways have you seen to be very effective that can not only be, like you said, very coherent, but really nails it down on what problem you're trying to solve for the customer, but also gets the team excited about what it is that they're going to build?
I mean, when I or the folks on my team are writing epics, one of the things that's really common is framing things in terms of user scenarios or jobs to be done, to try and say, a person, from this background told me they wanted to achieve this goal. And we can point to metrics on that. We can point to their success rates. We can find ways to inform that, but just framing that really concretely in terms of this type of user wants to achieve this task tends to be very helpful in terms of making sure that everyone's on the same page. More generally than that, though, one of the things that we try to do a lot at GitHub is just work in the open. And so there's a trap that people can fall into of just, they keep all their notes in Google Docs or something like that. And Google Docs are the least discoverable thing on the planet. No one will ever read them if you don't send them the link. And even then they might not. And so we do most of our sort of long-term thinking inside GitHub issues because it allows for more accidental discovery. I occasionally have salespeople that'll come into an issue where I'm collecting feedback on a particular problem, and the sales team will say, actually, my customer complained about that yesterday. Do you have thoughts on what we can do about it? Those kind of things help us give color to a problem and dimension more so than we have this one support thread in isolation. People can start to plus one onto that and give you more perspectives.
Cool. That's actually an interesting process-driven way of really gathering information to sort of like reassure that point that you're trying to make or that problem that you're trying to make. And not a lot of organizations do that. I'm sure there's like some tools that kind of crowdsource all the information from like Slack and Zendesk and support, but I think that that's like a very good, effective way to work, and also let your team know that this is actually a real problem. So definitely thanks for sharing that. Also, if you do have questions, feel free to put it in the chat. We'll have dedicated time for that at the end. The next question that I have for you, Justin, is you're working on a very technical product for developers, and technology changes very, very rapidly. How do you keep up with the demands and the changes that happen in the tech industry relating to what your users want from you?
I mean, the sad reality is usually not very well. We try and build products that are open and extensible, and we have APIs and we have ways for the community to self-serve on things. But with a sufficiently large audience and a sufficiently fast industry like ours, you're never going to meet every customer where they want you to. I talk to folks all the time, in my corner of supply chain, where they say, we want you to support our language. And I'll go look at the data. I was like, you're the 55th most popular language right now. And I don't support, the 20th most popular. I have to put that in front of you. And that is one of those really painful trade-offs, because when you have an excited community and you have folks that want to work with you, you aren't necessarily in a fixed engineering team size going to be able to support everybody. And so you have to figure out what are the things that you do yourself versus what are the things that you seed to the community and say, this is a capability that we're not going to be able to support you on because it's not strategic enough for us to put our engineering resources on.
Yeah, thank you so much for being very transparent and open about that, and to also hear and also reaffirm that like you never have all the resources you need to solve all the problems, and I think that's one of the things that we always try to highlight to our students. So in what ways have you found to be effective when saying no to customers? So this isn't saying no to your team. I mean, you gave the example of like, hey, you're the 55th. And there's the 20th. And some people, despite that, when you tell them that things are not the priority, in my experience in the past, they can get defensive, they can get upset, because they care about their problem and it's a problem to them. And you can also validate the fact that it's a problem, but you're also telling them that you can't solve it right now. How do you approach conversations like that, especially when it's like face to face, or even in like over email or in a forum, or even just like letting them know internally, and just like, because it's easy for someone to like take some feedback and say, hey, we're not solving this user's problem, but it's all about painful prioritization. But yeah, I'm curious if you had any like tips or strategies or experiences that you can share around telling people no in the best, kindest way possible.
I mean, in my experience, most customers would prefer to get a direct answer than to get one where you say, well, not right now, but maybe next quarter, and you have no expectation that it's coming next quarter. And so when I sit down with C-levels at these customers, right, they'll say, I really need this. We'll say, I appreciate that, but we're not close to executing on that. We're at least 12 months out. And if you can give them a sense of how far out you are before you think it's important, that helps, because it tells them, okay, great, maybe I should look at a different product to fill that need. Or it tells them, maybe I should build my own. And you give them, you take that uncertainty away of, well, maybe it's just around the corner. Maybe I just keep hoping. If you can give more clarity, you can better set customer expectations so they decide to either self-serve or find an alternative route.
That's super helpful, yeah. Like being able to just be clear, and even though you might lose them as a customer, at least you're helping them as a human being to just like really help solve that problem, even though that problem might not be with you. So that's super helpful. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I mean, just riffing on that a little bit, I would much rather tell a customer, I don't think we're a good fit for you, than to get one that comes in and buys the product and they find out later, because it's hard to win that trust back. It's so much better to just say, I don't think we're going to do the things you need us to. We're good at these things. We're not as good at these things. Here's the sort of honest accounting of what the product is capable of. That buys you so much more trustworthiness as an organization than the one that says, we will do everything you want amazingly, just sign the check. Because it's hard to repair those customer relationships once they've churned, because they might sign with that promise that it's going to get better, but when it hasn't in a year and a renewal comes up, they're not coming back.
Yeah, that's super helpful to hear, and just like being true to your customer, being very clear with them. I know in the past, I've had bugs in the backlog that's like 3 years old, and customers still asking for them, and we keep telling them, "Oh, we're gonna do it," and it never gets done. But being very firm, I think that is super helpful. So thank you so much for that note, even just like on a personal level. So now going back to GitHub, very technical product. Do you require having a technical degree or having a CS background to be a PM at GitHub? I'm just curious.
We do not. There are plenty of PMs and engineers and engineering managers that do not have a CS degree or an engineering degree of any kind. Usually, folks that end up coming into the organization with that non-traditional background, maybe they're an open source maintainer that goes and does a bunch of projects that are really noteworthy and visible. Maybe they've got experience, they came up through a boot camp and they learned the skills really quickly, and they've been working in smaller companies. It's much more important to us that folks have the everyday skills they need to be successful than it is that they have an academic background from 10 years ago. because ultimately that the value of that diminishes over time. Your job experience is the much more important indicator of your success.
Awesome. That thanks for preaching that. So could you just like also like give us like examples of those skills that you mentioned that are the like important skills as a product manager that you need to showcase? Like this is sort of like the level at which you should be performing as a product manager, you know, that you think it's important for you or that you've seen in the industry.
So, I mean, I think one of the things that's always tricky with product managers and PMs in general is there's this huge spectrum of different skill sets that folks might acquire. Some folks might go really heavy on project management. They're scrum masters. They're doing a whole bunch of detailed project management. Other folks are super user focused. They're doing user stories. They're doing interviews. And, you know, what I generally look for, at GitHub, you know, our organization is really focused on the product side, customer focus, ability to articulate customer problems, ability to prioritize those. And so I look for a resume where someone tells me about the types of problems they've solved, excuse me, and that they have, call it the experience in the areas that we care about. And so folks that really stand out are folks that have some experience working in developer tools or have some experience on technical products. And so if someone comes with a resume that has those kinds of experiences, they've built out APIs, they've built out databases, you know, for end customers that are developers, those are really strong resumes and backgrounds. And then in the interview, it's all about how did you present it? How did you talk about it? Folks that talk tech first instead of talking about the user's problems, how we prioritize those. You know, those folks end up not doing as well as the folks that do prioritize the user stuff first.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's so interesting because, like, you know, you serve developers, but those are users at the end of the day, and people who can keep their users top of mind are the PMs that tend to be the most successful. So I think one of the biggest takeaways from this talk and for everyone in the audience is, you know, always do what's best to serve your users, whoever like your users might be. So that's super helpful and reassuring to know. Could you also sort of like give us some tips for product managers out there that are, how do they best frame the problems, the user problems that they've solved, especially like maybe when it comes to a resume or like you said, during an interview? How do you expect them to talk about it in a way that's appealing and also lets you know that they're user focused, they care about their users and they're able to solve their problem and they did solve their user problems effectively?
I mean, it's really just effective storytelling. So tell me, what is the problem you're trying to solve? You know, if you're in a B2B environment, you're trying to sell a product to other companies, talk to me about the kind of companies you talked about. Tell me about the problems that they told you were a big challenge. And then tell me how you prioritized against these trade-offs, what solution you ended up settling on, how you delivered it, how you improved it over time. You know, one of the common follow-up questions you'll get when you've told me about that project you're really excited about is, why was that an exciting product for you? What are the cool things you learned? Oftentimes we want to see that folks are showing that excitement about the job, about the things that are important. And the actual subject matter is less important than bringing that focus and storytelling on the problems and the users that you're working against.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. So now even going back to the case of non-technical people, or imagine some people who don't have a non-technical background and they're working on, you know, very technical products like on GitHubs. You know, whenever they face technical challenges, how do you recommend they overcome some of those challenges, especially when it comes to like maybe, you know, you have that customer empathy, but you don't necessarily can sit in the same position as a developer, or maybe you haven't used some products before. How do you recommend they overcome some of those challenges that they might face?
You know, I always recommend that folks, if they've got the time to go work through the scenarios themselves, walk through the workflow, see the friction, log it, that's a good way to do that. If that's not possible, bring in a slightly larger audience to talk with. If you're doing these customer research interviews, customers are throwing terms at you that you've never heard. You better have someone as backup that knows what some of those are, so that you can, catch some of the follow-up questions that you might not have known to ask. I'm in the security space, and so one of the things that we'll do, we usually have a couple people that want to ride along on customer interviews, and one person will be assigned as scribe, and the other person will be there engaging on the direct questions. But it's important that we make sure that the ride-along person can ask questions at the end in case there's something that didn't get asked that really ought to, that sounded interesting to them. And that way you get a little bit more insight you can pull out. And then once you're done with that interview, share the recording internally, share the notes internally, and other people might pull out insights that you missed and help you understand some things that you should learn more about.
Cool, amazing. Thank you so much. So last couple of questions before we sort of like open it up for networking. Again, if you do have some questions, feel free to put it in the chat, or we'll just like wait till the end before we ask some of those questions. So, we have a lot of folks who are like aspiring product managers in the audience. What advice would you give people who are actively trying to break into product management? How should they stand out? What are the things that they should do to be able to sort of like land that first like PM gig, potentially like a top company? So yeah, what advice would you give folks?
So I will say one of the biggest mistakes I see when folks want to move to product, we'll get, applicants that have had a history as an engineer or a product designer or something like that, an adjacent job, and they just apply to product jobs. And from the resume reviewer's perspective, you go, oh, that's weird. They must have applied to the wrong queue, because there's nothing in the in the resume that says, I am seeking product management jobs and I am doing these things to be prepared for them. So first thing right up front, if you are seeking to break into product and you are not currently in product, acknowledge it right at the top of your resume. I am a person with this background seeking to break into product, and then highlight the sorts of things you've been doing to get there. If you're, in a product management school, or if you're doing product work on the side in your current job, like we see a lot of engineers that end up moonlighting as a product manager for their team because they don't have one. Highlight those things and talk about those experiences, because that's going to give you a lot more credibility than somebody that comes in with a resume that doesn't mention product at all. It doesn't imply that they're interested in product. Tell me about the things that you're doing to make yourself ready for that job.
Amazing. Yeah, that's super helpful. And the last question for you before we open it up for Q&A is, as you reflect on your career, you have an amazing career, 11 years in Microsoft, 4 years and counting in GitHub. What would you say are the most top influential moments or top 3 learnings that you've learned in your career that helps you as you make decisions now and you mentor people and you grow into these managerial roles with larger impacts and larger scopes? So could you just share some of those learnings with us?
I think one thing that's really important for every person to figure out is when you stop growing in an area to move on. So I stayed too long on one feature team and things were too easy. I was comfortable. I knew what was coming up. I knew the next 5 years of roadmap. I should have moved. Before I ever hit that, I just should have said, I'm too comfortable. I know too many things. I'm not growing enough. So, be your own best advocate. Get out of situations where you're too comfortable. The other things that I think are really important are, putting yourself in positions where you're working on products that are growing and getting additional energy. You work on a product where you're managing decline, you're managing an organization through tremendous attrition. Sometimes that happens. We're in an economic downturn right now, and there might be some lean times here. But if you find yourself in an organization where there are layoffs all around you and things aren't looking so good, look elsewhere, because you won't find opportunities. If you want to manage people, you're going to have to wait for your boss to leave so you can pick up the pieces. that's not a fun experience for anybody. It's way more interesting to join a company where you're on a thing that's exciting, that's being invested in, that's growing, and you start out and you can see a path for yourself to grow and develop more experience in front of you. That's probably my second one. And my third one is find great mentors and keep those folks close and meet with them and, use your network effectively. There are countless people I've stayed in touch with from past jobs. And I look for opportunities to bring them in and hire them. I look for opportunities to help them and, talk with them and share my network. Those things around who you know and the people that you are willing to help, those are some of your best allies in the industry. And so take care of your network and it will take care of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justin. Really appreciate all the learnings there. So now I wanted to open it up for questions. So if you do have questions, please don't be shy. This is a safe space. Feel free to put it in the chat. Happy to ask Justin as he spends the next couple of minutes with us before we open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions about anything, feel free to let us know. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to also raise your hand and I can help unmute you. All right.
I was trying to unmute myself, but I realized I don't have that. Hi, Justin. It was very interesting conversation. I wanted to ask, in terms of, not just resume, but sort of getting yourself out there. Like I see so many different stories about people doing such creative things. Like it could be, going on maybe like Canva, changing up their resume, or like even building your network, right? Like, how do you find is the best way to sort of reach out to find good mentors? Because right now, like I work at, luckily I work in the tech space, but I find it sometimes difficult to connect with mentors or find sort of what goals I'm getting with them. And maybe that's a me problem, but I just wanted to know that maybe there's a way to sort of, get organized with that, or sort of what you're looking for in terms of really putting yourself out there.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, there's no one size fits all answer for that.
Right.
If you know somebody that's in product, starting with just asking them directly is not a bad way to go. If you're breaking in kind of fresh, some of the, I would say, interest groups can be a real advantage. So for example, like inside GitHub, we have a bunch of communities of belonging that we have. And so folks that are in roles where they're not in product and they want to be, one of the great ways that they can go and meet and network with folks in product or in roles that they want to get to is being part of those communities of belonging, meeting people in those positions and building relationships so you can go and have that conversation of what would it take if I wanted to do that kind of job? What kind of experiences would I need? And I'll say even beyond that, I've had people kind of randomly on LinkedIn just send a nice message and say, hey, I'm really interested in learning how to be a product manager at a company like yours. I would love to take 15 minutes and learn a couple things. And you'll get a couple responses. You won't get responses from everybody.
Right.
And so don't expect that, but you might be able to get in contact with some folks and get some advice, and maybe they've got some places they can point you. It never hurts to ask, I suppose.
Great. Awesome. Thank you.
Of course.
Cool. Awesome. We have another question from Salman. So I'll just read it out, but you're also welcome to read it out. And then I think we have another question from Christina and Andrea, if we have some time. Outside of support and sales, product has the most open roles at GitHub. All 12 openings are for senior staff and 1 director role. With openings skewed to a sort of like senior roles, how does GitHub nurture product talent from within? It's a very good question.
It's so tough. The way that GitHub is set up, we aren't really set to bring up the next generation of product managers. A lot of organizations that do will have an associate product manager program where they'll put people on a rotation, get them enough experience so that they know what they're doing, and then assign them to a team. Microsoft was sort of unique in that they did hire folks into their PM roles straight out of university, and that gave folks sort of a safe space to learn. But at GitHub, we set up our teams where the product manager and engineering manager are tied at the hip. And so bringing someone in that has no experience in product and saying, all right, a team of 8 or 12 engineers now depends on you for priorities, go, feels a little bit stark. So those bigger organizations, your Microsofts, your Oracles, your Googles, your Facebooks, those are the sorts of places where they have APM programs and they have ratios that are set up in a way where they can nurture and grow people into product manager jobs. In terms of how we nurture folks inside of our organization, we do try and hire. I would say GitHub tries to be the second job for a lot of product managers. So we'll wait until they've had some experience at another place. We try and get them in at 3 or 5 years, because that means that they have a lot of basic experience, and then we can help grow them into the senior and staff level product managers inside the organization. But it's going to vary company to company.
Quick follow-up to that, and then we'll ask Christina's question quickly, Justin. Yeah, I know you mentioned like some of those bigger companies that have like APM programs, the Googles, the Facebooks. Those programs are insanely competitive. Like for one APM role, you can get about thousands and thousands of applicants. So in that case, what do you do to like stand out and even just get yourself to be one of those? Because it's incredibly competitive. So what tips or knowledge you can share with us?
I mean, I've never had the I've recruited for Microsoft PM roles. I haven't dealt with any of the other companies. I will say the people that tend to be most successful getting into those have some background, whether that's they've completed an educational program or they're doing some amount of light product work in an adjacent space. Those are the folks that I see probably have the biggest edge to get into those. And so if you don't have, product experience, one of the best things that you can maybe look to do is to, and this is advice I give to folks in engineering as well. A lot of open source projects really need smart people like all of you, and would be quite happy if you came by, especially during Hacktoberfest when they're looking for new contributors, and offered to help. And offered to do product work for them, and offered to figure out some of the problems and all of that. It's not a fast path, though. It takes a long time to build trust and to build that kind of relationship. But when I have folks that come and they say like, yeah, I've been doing a lot of product work, with the Kubernetes Foundation, boy, that's fast path into, yeah, I want to know more about what you're doing to manage and understand and work with that community successfully. Those are things that you can absolutely do to distinguish yourself, or finding open source projects and just earnestly contributing to them.
Cool, awesome. Thank you so much for that, like honest feedback. Over to you, Christina, final question, and then we'll move on to the networking portion of the event.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been super. I have lots of notes. So I am part of CoLab, just started on Monday as a product manager. And I am leading a team of 2 developers who, and my whole team has never had a PM before. And so I'm already kind of struggling with, they're like, well, my job isn't until 3 weeks from now. And so if you have any tips on like encouraging them or ways to foster communication and collaboration in the earlier, brainstorming, ideation, wireframe stages, and like, I don't any kind of tips, because I'm already through day 3 and I'm like, oh no, like how can I connect with these developers who are already slightly checked out until they get a task that's handed to them?
Oh, geez. I mean, first of all, developers should never be checked out until they're assigned a task. That is like red flag city, because ultimately these should be folks that are really excited about solving the problem. And one of the things that I do early in a product journey is we spend a lot of time coming to shared understanding of what the problems are. And so I don't know if you've done the sticky note exercises. FigJam is amazing for that. Get the team together, talk through the things that you all know together about the problem space, the customer, the potential solutions. Do that brainstorming. If you're not ready for that, then by no means should your engineers be sitting on their hands. They should be coming with you to go and do customer research. Set up some interviews. You want them to hear from the customers directly, because ultimately they will develop far more empathy seeing somebody and hearing them say, I have this specific problem, than they will hearing you say it. And if they've got nothing else going on, that's job number one, is let's learn what the problems are and develop the empathy so that we as an organization can be more successful. Yeah. Engineers should never be checked out. One of the things that we talk a lot about at GitHub is we bias towards hiring product engineers. And I see some of my colleagues are on the line, and they'll hold me honest on this, but we bias towards hiring product engineers because we have such a high ratio of product to engineering that product managers are not the ones that are responsible for making every decision. And so when we're designing a UI or implementing a feature, there are a lot of small product decisions that happen every day. And in some organizations, the engineers defer to product on every one of those decisions. I had engineers at one team that would not write a string on a user experience. They'd write a placeholder and ask me to fill in a real string. And effective engineers will go and make a best effort to make something good and then tweak as necessary, because it turns out they're smart people. We hired them to make decisions, not to ask questions and just sort of wait to be told what to do. So have that like really honest talk with them, because yeah, no one wants those folks to sit on their hands.
Perfect answer, Justin. I'm going to clip that. I'm going to show it to the entire cohort, because I think the very first week of the program is very important to get people excited about the problem and what they're going to solve. Thank you so much, Justin, for taking the time to speak with us today. Lots of amazing gems that you've shared today. We'll definitely be breaking all of these things that you've set up into like a blog post and also sharing that moving forward. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I really do appreciate it. Next up, we'll spend like just a couple minutes in breakout rooms speaking with each other and reflecting on the conversation. Feel free to stick around for that. I'm going to stop recording now.